everybody, and welcome to Keep Your Mind in Tune, episode 1. In each one of these episodes, we're going to have a panel of musicians and industry professionals who get the unique chance to interview professors, lawyers, authors, activists, law enforcement, really anybody who has hands-on experience and facts they can offer to our audience of music fans and beyond. In addition, at the end of each episode, you'll see a unique musical collaboration between some of your favorite musicians that you cannot find anywhere else. So be sure to stick around for that. And now, let's waste no more time. We have some great guests joining us today to inform us on some very important topics, some very timely topics in their various fields of expertise. We've also got a great panel that I'd like to introduce. First up, she is one of my favorite drummers out there. Her resume includes touring with Beyonce, Maceo Parker, Dumpsta Funk, and of course, most recently, her own personal project along with several other great musicians, The Nth Power. Give it up for Nikki Glaspie, everybody. Thank you so much, Nikki, for being here.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Also one of my very favorite people, as well as favorite drummers. So just wanted to mention that too. Another one of my favorite people is joining us as well, Mr. Kunj Shah, who is the founder of Live for Live Music, which I'm sure many of you are quite aware of, as well as co-founder with me of this program right here that you're watching, and concert promoter, Brooklyn Comes Alive, Denver Comes Alive, and more recently a virtual concert promoter, Justice Comes Alive, Quarantine Comes Alive, raised $250,000 for some amazing causes, and now soon to be Democracy Comes Alive on October 3rd. Kunj, thank you so much for joining us here.
Hey, Dave. How's it going? And we also got Dave Brandwein of Turkuaz.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Dave Brandwein. It's so good to be here. And yes, I play in Turkuaz. I produce music. But really, with all of that said, what we all do in the music realm, we are here for a different reason. We want to get some accurate information out there about things where there's a lot of confusion these days. And we're going to do a few of these things. And I think the first thing we wanted to focus on for good reason is voting. As as much as that can seem like something that's boring, it's not very boring right now. It's actually pretty exciting, and it's changing every single day. So we've got a few different guests lined up that we're going to get started with here pretty soon. But I mean, are you guys as confused and worried as I am about this upcoming election?
Yeah, man. I think that a lot of people are. I think that we're not the only ones. So I am very excited for this because we'll be talking to some experts and people that study and that know facts. And that's what we're after, are facts, truth, so that people can accurately make decisions on how they will go about voting and voting safely. I mean, I think that's probably the major concern, is that we have this deadly virus out here, and people are trying to figure out how to vote.
Yep.
And I'm one of those people, because I live in a state that you would have to have a reason for absentee voting, and I can't go anywhere, so I don't have that. So that means I have to show up in person.
I agree. I mean, I feel like when we first started talking about doing this project, it was about, we started talking about the conversations that were happening, or, between people that we knew, or whether on social media, and none of them really felt fact-based, and people just weren't really trying to understand what was actually happening. They were just trying to argue with one another. And I think, what we're trying to do is kind of bring a fact-based approach and ask questions that we all have to people that study this, whether professors who are meant to study this and teach this kind of stuff in a nonpartisan way, or people who have had experiences in the field with the many topics that we deal with in today's world that are very complicated. And as much as people are trying to simplify things in black and white, there is a lot of gray out there. But there's also a lot of information out there that I feel like the general public just doesn't know. And I'm excited to learn from people that have studied this and know what they are talking about, instead of, everybody on social media these days being a scientist or a, professor or whatever they think they are at the, the hour or the time, or, whenever the mood strikes them, or whatever the last article they read. We wanted to talk to people who actually study and read about and teach this type of stuff
for a living. Yeah. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and even Google are not really the best ways to get facts. You're really essentially getting opinions, and so that's what this is all about. So without any further ado, let's dive on into our first guest.
Kunj, you look like a schoolboy today.
Yeah, right.
You're a schoolboy.
Studio
Buttoned up.
Buttoned up. I have a lot of neck now, I realize.
Should I do my top button too?
Oh my
I
God.
don't think so. All right. For this segment, we have the honor of being joined by Andy Bernstein, who is founder of headcount.org. I think many people out there are familiar with Headcount, especially music fans. Welcome, Andy. Thank you for being here and joining us.
Thank you. It's great to see you all.
It's good to see you too. Well, maybe for those who don't know, would you like to tell us just the basic idea of what Headcount is all about?
Sure. Headcount, we've been around about 15 years, doing a little more than that, doing voter registration in the music scene and the entertainment world. So we started out very much in the core jam scene. Mark of the Disco Biscuits is my co-founder. And the first bands we worked with were Mo and Michael Franti and Leftover Salmon. And then that summer, we ended up on tour with The Dead. We're touring that summer, Dave Matthews and Fish. And then since then, it's really expanded out. And so this year we did Billie Eilish tour. Last year we did Ariana Grande. During the pandemic, we've done a lot more in the digital space. We partner with Spotify, and Global Citizen is a big partner of ours now. We're rolling out a big campaign with them. So it's, it's all about just taking the power of music and harnessing it toward democratic participation.
How many people have you guys registered to vote to date?
It's a little over 700,000, and that's as of early September. I think it'll grow hopefully by anywhere from 50 on the low end, 100,000 on the high end over the next 6 weeks, because it always comes in really big right before the deadlines to register to vote.
And that's just what you could track, I'm sure, just the headcount message getting out there over and over through various platforms and festivals and partners of yours when you guys are doing, having each musician across the music spectrum just putting up signs on voter registration day. That's probably not as easy to track. So I'm guessing it's probably over 1 million plus.
Oh, yeah. What we are tracking is we track what we call voter actions, and that's like somebody asking for their absentee ballot on our site or visiting an information page. And we just added that up for the year, and we're already at 1.4 million. So that's like specific things that somebody did. They like texted us or something like that. So yeah, for everybody we register, there's another maybe 10 people who are doing something else that helps them vote. And then there's probably 10 people on top of that who are just hearing the message. And I think that last part is probably in some ways the most important, because our messengers are musicians. Our messengers are people of great influence who have a strong spiritual connection with the individuals who are their fans. And, we all know the power of music, and we know that when somebody is in a live music setting, which we all remember fondly, that your like brain is open, your soul is open. And when we can bring a message about the power that we have as citizens, as a collective, I really do believe, there's no way to measure it, but I really do believe that we're reaching people that will never know we're reaching, and they might not even know we're reaching them, because it sort of gets planted deep within your soul. And it really comes down to your role as a citizen in this country. And right now, the role of citizens in this country is sort of in jeopardy. There's so many there's just so much angst around the voting process and so much potential interference that we're at a point now where if we don't step up and we don't really assert our rights, those rights, just when it comes to voting, can be taken away. And this is something that I think that, wherever your politics are, there's strong feelings about voting systems right now. And is our system fair? And is our system truly representative of the will of the people? And you can ask people on different sides of the fence, and they'll have a different view of what the problems are, but everybody agrees there are problems. And we're working really hard to try to address some of those problems, because registering voters is only half the battle. It's actually getting your vote to count. That's the next step. And then there are other steps after that, in terms of being an active citizenry and keeping elected officials accountable. But we got to get to November, and there's just a lot to be done between then and now.
I remember my first encounter with you guys, or hearing about you guys. I was just so excited, honestly, that there was someone that was on the scene that took the initiative to do this, because I think that there's a lot of shame around not knowing your voting rights, or just knowing just how to vote. Be registered to vote. Some people do it when they get their license or whatever. But actually, you can answer this question: is how do people register to vote, and how do they know that they're registered to vote?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. And sometimes I even forget myself, because we're doing this every day, how some things that might be second nature to somebody are a mystery to someone else. And there, as you said, there is no shame in that. There's no shame in not knowing something, as long as you just take the steps to try to know it. We start knowing nothing. We learn it all. But in most states, you can register to vote online, and you can go to our website, headcount.org, and register to vote online. And there's a lot of other things we have there. You can check your voter registration status. And that's something every American should do before October 4th, because 16 million names will come off the voter rolls between the last election and now. And some of those people, it's legit. They're deceased. They moved. They registered in another place. And some of it is not legit. And if you haven't voted in the last two elections, in some states, there are kind of tricks where they're not supposed to take you off the voter rolls. But there could be things like they send you a postcard, like a nondescript postcard. And if you don't answer it, then you're taken off the voter rolls. And that is very intentional. It is intentionally they're almost trying to not get noticed. And so everybody should check their voter registration status. You can do that at headcount.org as well. You can sign up for an absentee ballot if that's how you want to vote. Early voting, which is actually what we recommend as the single best way to vote in person early. And there's lots of other things. You can find out where your polling place is closer to election day, find out what's on your ballot. We're going to add something to the website about how to talk to friends who might not vote. And that's something I think we can all identify with, because we all know people who don't vote. About half of young people don't vote. So if you have friends, you know people who don't vote. And how do you have that conversation? We recommend doing it in a way that isn't judgmental. Nobody likes having a finger waved at them. Just try to listen. There are a lot of reasons that people don't vote. And we encourage people to have that conversation, because, your friends and family, you have a lot of influence over them. Studies actually show that the number one factor on getting someone to vote who isn't a frequent voter is their friends and family, more so than TV advertising, more so than mail, more so than even musicians. So all of us are empowered to influence our surroundings, and having that difficult conversation with friends who don't vote. It isn't that difficult if you kind of know what they might say and are prepared with good responses. So we're putting some of that on our website that we're going to roll out mid-September.
Yeah, I feel like I just literally about 30 minutes ago signed up for my absentee ballot. And I only did that because I'm living in Denver but registered in New York. And the DMV has been closed due to coronavirus. So I just requested my absentee ballot. But I did feel, like Nikki was talking about, almost embarrassed to search where I was going to go to get my absentee ballot, and it's good to know you could just go to headcount.org and get that?
Yeah, we make it really easy. We've had tens of thousands of people get their absentee ballots, and then what we do is if they request the absentee ballot through our website, then we'll follow up with you and we'll take you through the process. And this process is not a simple process. For one thing, and it varies by state, but in most states it's a two-step process. You request your absentee ballot, you get it back, then you fill it out and mail it in. And there are a lot of things that can trip you up when doing it. Some states require a stamp, some don't. I just read that Ohio requires 2 stamps. If you make a stray mark, it might not count. If you tape it shut rather than lick it shut, it might not count. And then you get into the things that really are tripping up a lot of people, which is signature match and lateness of arrival. Now, we think of things as like postmark. Well, postmark in about half the states doesn't mean crap. It's when your ballot arrives. And if it doesn't arrive by election day, your vote doesn't count. Now, here's a mind-blowing figure you're not going to believe. In the recent New York State primary, 21%, 1 out of 5 mail-in ballots were rejected. And it was almost all because they arrived late. I mean, 1 out of 5. And imagine if 1 out of 5, and so many people are planning to vote by mail this year, imagine if 1 out of 5 get rejected. And when you further consider that because of the politicization of voting by mail, it's going to be a lot more Democrats that vote by mail than Republicans. So if you have a lot of vote by mail being rejected, it's going to favor one candidate over the other, one party over the other. And it's never been like that before because voting by mail was never politicized before. It didn't have a partisan bent or advantage. So now that it's been politicized, this could change the results of the election. So we want everybody to know that if you are going to vote by mail, do it. For one thing, get it in early. A lot of states have what's called a cure period, which is if there's a problem with your ballot, they'll call you. So get it in as early as possible. If you are anywhere near election day, don't put it in the U.S. Postal Service. Drop it off personally. You can drop it off at the county election office or sometimes in drop boxes. Every state but Tennessee, you can drop it off personally. There's a lot of ways to make sure your vote counts, but there's a lot of ways that your vote doesn't count if you're not careful. And the craziest one of all is that if your signature doesn't match what's on your voter registration, it can be rejected. And who remembers what their signature looked like the day they registered to vote? If you registered through the DMV, the good news is you'll see it on your driver's license in most states. So you can actually look at your signature and try to make it match. If you registered like on paper or something like that, really your best bet is almost to re-register, use a very good signature, and then use your like best signature the second time. Now this is the kind of thing that I got to admit, I do this for a living. I didn't know any of this till literally a few weeks ago. Like we're doing this 16 years and none of this was on my radar. And I started reading up on it, and it's been in the news more, that this is millions and millions of people have been affected by this without even knowing. And it's come out more and more in the last few years. And we have a duty now to make sure that every American is educated about this topic and can make an informed decision as to whether they want to vote by mail or vote in person. And obviously the pandemic means, there are implications to voting in person, but that's why we recommend voting early. If you vote early, you don't have to wait on a line. You can do it before potentially, flu season is coming. And there's a fear that by November, the pandemic could get worse. It hasn't gotten a lot better and it could get worse. So if you are comfortable leaving your home, if you are going to stores and restaurants or whatnot, we recommend that you vote early in person, get it done, be there, and that is your best chance of having your vote count at a time when it's absolutely critical.
That's a good point, especially with head count. I think maybe one of my first times registering, or my only time registering to vote, was at a music festival. So I don't know what my signature looks like from back then. So my best bet
is I tell you, Kunj, I know what you looked like back then. And, so you might want to check that out. And it's a real thing. Like you could, if you're going to vote by mail, what I would recommend to you, Kunj, is just re-register whatever address you're voting on. And, Colorado has a terrific voting system too. That's an all vote by mail system. Colorado has one of the most problem-free systems. It is a very high voter turnout and participation in Colorado. But if you want to vote in New York, I would recommend go to headcount.org, register again, be very mindful of your signature. There's no penalty for registering a second time. And And, and this is one of those things that you never would think of in a million years. There was an article recently in Fast Company about this, and it literally was one of the first ever pieces of national press about signature match. So you're going to hear more about it in the coming weeks, I have no doubt. But now is the time for everybody to realize and prepare.
You've sort of answered a lot of what my next questions were going to be already, which is great. But just to be clear, that signature match issue could still be an issue if you request an absentee or mail-in, and even if you physically drop it off, that's still the same thing, right? Because you didn't show up and say, I'm here, and go through the process in person. You're dropping it off. They could apply the same signature rule, right?
That is correct, yeah. And that's why voting in person, once you vote in person, you're basically verified. They're saying this is you. And some states require ID. Some states, you're doing a match right there where you're kind of seeing your signature next to it. Every state varies. And it's just one of these things where it should be simple. And why isn't it simple? Well, sometimes it's just government bureaucracy and, incompetence or inefficiencies. And sometimes it's very purposefully not simple. And one of the things we know is that the people who are disproportionately impacted by these barriers are generally people of color and also young people. And that's not an accident. Come on. The people making these decisions are the people who've been elected to office, and the system benefits them. And they don't want the system to change. They don't want new voters coming in. They want the exact electorate that got them into office to continue to be the electorate. So we've got a lot of work to do as a country to tear down these barriers. I think there's more awareness of these things. I think that the social justice movement has opened a lot of eyes to where inequities and systemic racism exists. And it exists in our voting system in the most quantifiable way. Like, it is the differences in that. Just thinking about how long lines are at polling places. I saw a study a few years ago that the average Black person waits online, I think it was 2 or 3 times longer than the average white person. And think about how messed up that is. Like, we know how many people are going to vote in each location based on what's happened in the past. And sure, cities are more dense than rural areas, and that explains a lot of it. But what it doesn't explain is the under-resourcing. Like, cities are more dense, so have more voting machines. Like, that's a no-brainer. It's nice. I live in a small rural town, and it's nice. I don't wait online for anything. I don't even wait online at the DMV. But bottom line is, like, we know in a city what the numbers of people are. When you see these long lines and you hear these stories of people waiting 6 hours, this is 100% preventable because it happens every time. And the fact that it's not being prevented is systemic racism in its purest, most quantifiable form. And it's why it's so important that we as citizens ultimately make voting rights an issue that we stand up for, that we vote on. Right now, it's not like somebody's getting, and I think this is changing, but historically, people aren't getting elected by talking about voting rights. There are issues that people care about a lot, and voting rights isn't in the top 10. But I do think that there is now more awareness of that these are these fundamental democracy issues. And whether it's voting rights or gerrymandering or keeping money out of politics and all these things, we as citizens need to punish the elected officials that don't stand up for these things. And it's both parties. I mean, let's not fool ourselves. There is just, if you look at within the Democratic Party primaries, how much shenanigans there were. Some of it, again, just incompetence, and some of it very purposeful.
So for this coming election, what is your advice to the average voter, the average young voter?
Well, I would say that, voting itself, if you plan it, and there are studies that show that those who plan their votes are much more likely, and it's just like anything else, you don't know what your situation is going to be right now on November 3rd, especially as it relates to the pandemic. So plan it out, figure out when you're going to do it, decide, are you going to vote early in person, check, recommended, or vote by mail, or vote on election day. If you are voting, in person, plan how you're going to get there. Another reason that I'd recommend voting by mail, voting in person early, is you can do it with friends. If you're voting locally, you can only vote with people who live in your district, and those districts can be small. It can be a few blocks. But early voting is generally done at the county level or election office level. So you can be like, hey, your friend, hey, want to meet up? Go vote with me and let's get lunch or something like that. Make voting fun. Make it an activity. Take a picture. Take a picture with your sticker. Take a picture of yourself mailing in your ballot. Put it on social media. You will get likes. I promise you will get likes when you put a photo of.
All we really want here.
That's all I want, man. Like I'm in it for you know. I'm gonna go mad viral this year when I.
And again, you know, we want to point out obviously you vote in person. If it's early, it's probably going to be less densely populated and it will inherently be safer. But you obviously want to be safe, and people with health conditions, it is about just getting it in early, right? So like, it's not as though you have to vote in person, but as we've seen, we're going to see skewed results. We're not going to get the results the night of the election, and so the more people that can feel safe voting in person, it actually is a good way to do it if you feel all right about it.
That's exactly right. And I would never tell anybody to vote in person if they are quarantining, if they have a previously existing condition, immune condition, and they are taking precautions everywhere else in their life. But I would say to anybody who is out and about, who is going to stores and things like that, which I think is still the overwhelming majority of the population, especially the young population. I don't want to scare anybody off here, and I think that's a risk here. I think that the voting system is more complicated than it should be, but it's not as complicated as a lot of other things we have to do. It's not as complicated as trying to win the fish ticket lottery. It is not as complicated as getting a medical card in a medical state for cannabis. It is trying to think of other things that I struggle with, like paying bills. That I find complicated. Setting up like my checking account for auto payment, which I haven't done with half my bills because I'm too lazy and weirded out. Voting is easier than all those things.
Man, you've done such a good job of covering all the things I possibly could have thought of to ask about. So now
can I interview you guys?
I don't know. I don't know if I have anything that you don't know already. Thank you, Andy.
All right. Much love, guys. Thank you.
All right, everybody. Our next guest is Mariela Meza, who works with 15 different schools in the 5 boroughs of New York City, helping to use students as a way into families and let people know what's going on in the community, who's running for local office, and making people more interested in voting, getting them engaged. Welcome, Mariela. Thank you so much for joining us here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to dive into this conversation with you guys and hopefully leave behind some nuggets of inspiration to get people out to the polls in November.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think it's really, really important, and thank you again. So how have you used the communities across these 15 different schools to educate the families? Again, it's not only the students but the families that you're working with. So how did you go about that? How do you get the families involved and make it a wider net that you spread?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, I do work with 15 schools, and those schools range from elementary to middle to one high school even. And so we do work with the high school seniors while they're applying for colleges, and we do walk them through a lesson on voter registration and why it's so important to be civically engaged. And what I think that has evolved into throughout the last couple of years that we've done it is kind of this rite of passage into adulthood, right? You're now turning 18. Yes, you're going to college, you're going to do all the fun things in college, but you also have this responsibility to make sure that you're advocating on behalf of your community. On the middle school and elementary school level, we do have communities within these schools. I think that's the beauty of helping and getting involved with middle and elementary schools, is that parents drop off their kids or they come and pick up their kids after school. So you know that there's an adult who will be in the building at one point or another. And we've built really good partnerships with the social workers and the office managers at these schools who will let us know, okay, right before Thanksgiving, we're going to have a potluck. there's going to be tons of people here. Can you show up and talk about voter registration? And I think, those partnerships have really made my job easier in leading advocacy. And it's also a really organic way to plug into a community where there's already trust, right? You, as a parent, go to a school and you know that whatever information you get from your school is trustworthy and is dependable. And I think that's saved us a lot of work in the long run.
Can you describe to our viewers the importance of down-ballot voting and the importance of voting for all your state and city and local officials?
Yes, so that is such a good question. It gets me so fired up because I like to look at data to inform not only myself, but to make sure that I'm making valid arguments when I'm trying to convince somebody to either register to vote or to participate in a particular election. Historically, we do know that presidential elections, because you see the candidates on TV, you're hearing about it on the radio, there are more people that go out and vote on those elections. And oftentimes, because those elections have a lot of attention on them, people forget that there's also local elections for either your city council member, your state senator, people who are closer to the ground, who know your neighborhood better, that often get forgotten about. And so as a result, even in my own community and communities in New York City, I've seen elections where someone will get elected to the state assembly seat, which makes a lot of huge decisions, especially around funding for schools or funding for bus stops or services that people in the community need, and they will win by 70 votes. Now, I know I'm pretty shy and I don't like to put myself out there too much, but I have more than 70 Facebook friends. I know I have more than 70 followers on Instagram, and I just think about, if I posted something on social media reminding people to go out and vote, I could potentially swing an election for someone who's going to be in office and make big decisions about my neighborhood for the next 4 years at least. I definitely, just again to do the plug on community boards, a lot of local smaller organizations that do the everyday groundwork do show up at these meetings, and they do have good relationships with whoever is running for office. And so what you will see as we get closer to November or to a date when a primary election is happening where, there is more focus on these local elections, is that they will host town halls to make sure that we're learning everything about everyone who's going to be on that ballot.
Yeah, probably like the most important, like you said, because it's like right in your community, and these people are like making decisions just like, your city officials, and I think it's also like crazy that like we don't know who is representing us in our communities, and we actually have the power to change that, but yeah, I feel like we've all been guilty of that, or that the information is just not so forthcoming, or it's something that we don't think about because we're always thinking on such a bigger level, like a national level, like thinking about our senators and our congressmen. But like there's people right here, that live with us, that are speaking for us, that are making up the greater voice. So those voices are equally as important.
Yes, Nikki, and you bring up a great point about access to this information and, knowing who the key players are. Something that we have to keep in mind is that, knowledge is power. And a lot of times, some people who have been in office for a really long time really do count on the fact that, only 30% of the people, that I represent actually go out and vote. So maybe it's better that no one shows up to the community board, or maybe it's better that, no one is really working on getting out the vote, because it makes their job easier and they can stay in office longer. And, that's one of the sad realities.
Yeah. Well, they abuse the power to get whatever agenda across that they're trying to get. Most of the time they're getting paid. Like, oh, this guy wants to build a building. Oh, here's like 50 grand to make sure that happens. Like, I mean, we watch it like on television all the time, but I know that that's like real life. How many times have people been caught in like corruption scandals because they took this money to do, something that like the town didn't want. So I think that we definitely need to take responsibility for that. Everyone individually as a community, making up the community. I think that goes for, judges too, because we just had, I live in Texas, and we just had, just like everybody else, we had primary, and there were judges and, people that wanted to, they were running for the board, and it's like, you have to know who these people are. Superintendent of schools, like who's making decisions about your children's education. Super important.
Yeah, even the parks department. I mean, I just had an issue where our lake that I live right next to had a giant fish kill where all like 10,000 of all the fish in the lake had died, and I didn't know what to do. And I was kind of embarrassed about that, but eventually I found the right contact to get, in touch with the government's environmental program, the statewide environmental program, who sent an aquatic biologist to go test the water to realize there was an algae bloom, sent me the results of that, and gave me a whole rundown. And I was like, oh, wait, so government does work, if the populace is engaged and like, they actually went out and tested the water and then called the person who complained, who was me, to let me know the exact levels and pH balances in the lake and why the fish kill had happened and what they're going to do to mitigate it, and the homeowners association of the area had sent them something about 2-3 months ago on how to prevent that. And, the town board, they just didn't listen. So like, I feel like if more people are aware of these things that are happening in their local community, even on the parks level, it's just important. A democracy only works if it has a engaged citizenship.
Yeah, and that's such a great point. I think, what we have to remind people of is that our elected officials are public servants and they work for us. And so it is, part of their job description to do due diligence, to listen to, citizens and people who are engaged and really hear everyone out on what their concerns are. And I think, just going back to the importance of voting on local elections, you can't just walk into, the president's office whenever you want, but you can walk down the block and walk into your state assembly member's office. You could talk to your city council member if you see them at an event or at the park, or doing something on the street.
And speaking of keeping people engaged and keeping people interested and helping them realize that they can actually sway things significantly in their local area, also there's quite a big presidential election coming up, which we shouldn't totally ignore either. And you said, we've spoken before, Mariela, and you told me that you used to kind of be a little less interested and feel like maybe your vote didn't count, your vote didn't matter so much. I think you see maybe a little bit of it in some of the communities that you work in. What do you think caused that feeling that your vote didn't count? Or what do you think causes that feeling currently for people?
Yeah, sure thing. I think, part of it is cultural differences. In college, wasn't interested in politics. I actually majored in art history. And that's been a passion of mine. But I was a high school teacher for a couple of years, and I found that a lot of my students did want to achieve and perform well academically, but there were issues beyond the four walls of my classroom that really impacted the way they learned. And a lot of things were things beyond what they should be dealing with at their age group. I had one student who had to work 2 jobs because her mom was on disability and had some issues with that. And that's directly related to how the government was dealing with that situation. I had students who, didn't have access to childcare. And so they couldn't engage in extracurricular activities because they had to be home to take care of their younger siblings. And so I moved back to New York, and what I really wanted to focus on was finding ways to remove those obstacles so that kids could really focus on education and break the cycles that, they were kind of brought into. And so I did start going to community boards. I started meeting people, and I started seeing that, if I did go to a community board meeting in 2015, when we had the elections in 2016, I saw that some of the people who consistently showed up to those meetings were actually interested in running for office. And I think we're definitely seeing that now. We're going to see it in 2021 when we have upcoming city council elections. People that I've met at those meetings who have shown up and who actually know the community are now taking the additional responsibility of saying, hey, I feel like I can represent my community better than whoever has been in office for a really long time. And I've been to these meetings, and I know the community, and they know me, and they're my neighbors. And this is how I'm deciding to show up for my community. So I think that's been really empowering for me to know that, yes, the person on that poster or the person on that commercial actually sits in a monthly meeting with me and gives their evening time to making sure that they know what's going on in my neighborhood.
Yeah, that's how AOC got elected, because the guy that she was running against was an incumbent who was extremely comfortable, thought no one had really given a serious challenge to his seat in a while. And she started holding these meetings, right? I watched this documentary and he didn't show up. So she's sitting with an empty chair, and then a bunch of members of the community are there asking questions, and she's there to answer them, engage them. She went door to door and beat this guy who I forget how many times in the past he'd won, but it's an incredible story, It's and it just goes to show how acting on, working on a local level can really, it's amazing how many new people you can get engaged that way.
Absolutely. You've already touched on it already, but what can we do, as individuals in our community to, up until election day, like what can we do to like really spread the word and like make sure that we're doing everything that we can in our communities?
I think the most successful movements have been through just sharing what you know with your immediate family and your small group of friends, right? If you're one person and you tell 5 friends, and those 5 friends each tell 5 more friends, you're multiplying your impact by just doing that. Another really fun way and concrete way that I do this is that whenever there's an upcoming election or I've gone out and vote, I try to go out and vote really early. I'll post a selfie with my I voted sticker, and usually friends will get curious and say, oh, I didn't know there was an election happening, or, oh, what are we voting for this time around? And so people, do become more engaged, ask questions, and it's a way for you to say, hey, maybe I don't feel comfortable telling you who to vote for, or maybe I do and I have my agenda, but if I don't, I have these resources, and because you trust me, you're going to listen, and you're going to actually go out and vote.
Well, thank you so much, Mariela, for all your time, and we appreciate having you on.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, guys.
Bye. So joining us now is Professor Joshua A. Douglas from University of Kentucky Rosenberg College of Law. Thank you so much for joining us here, Professor.
Thanks so much for having me.
We really appreciate you being here. So you have written a book called Vote for Us, How to Take Back Our Elections and Change the Future of Voting. Also, I know you study the field of voting rights, election law, as well as many other things. But first, maybe start off by telling us a little bit about your book, the topics you cover, and how you feel it pertains to the upcoming election and really our election systems in general.
Sure. So, most of what we hear about when people talk about the right to vote is doom and gloom, right? There's this sense that it's becoming harder to participate in our democracy, especially for certain kinds of people, certain demographic groups. There's this feeling that the system is rigged. And, you hear that from both sides, from both the left and the right for different reasons. And yet what I learned through a lot of my research is that there's a lot of good news on the ground in communities all over the country where people are trying to make our system more inclusive, more democratic, to break down barriers, to make it more convenient to vote. And so my book tells the stories of these everyday Americans. I call them democracy heroes or democracy champions that are working to bring more people into the political process, to break down barriers to participation and make it easier to vote. And these are some amazing individuals that I profile, and through their stories, I try to make the case for various reforms to our election system, various things that states and localities are already doing in how we run our elections to get as high turnout as possible. I end the book with this notion of 90% turnout. Typically in a presidential election, we have 60% turnout nationwide. In a midterm, a congressional election, it's much lower. In 2018, we had 50% turnout, and people were celebrating. That was amazing. And I thought, half the people didn't show up. How is this amazing? I mean, it's good historically. We can do a lot better. And so the book is really a call to action to all of us to go into our communities, to dive in and to make this thing so much better. And I think doing so can really change the scope of our democracy.
Wow. Yeah.
So can you explain for people who don't know what voter suppression is and possibly how that is carried out, how it's executed?
I think a good definition is simply any policy or mechanism or practice that makes it harder for people to vote. And typically what we see is that these sorts of things like strict photo ID requirements for voting or purges of the voter registration rolls, proof of citizenship requirements to register. Some states tried to pass a law that you had to provide a documentary proof of your citizenship in order to register. Historically, we had things like the poll tax or literacy tests, or you can't register to vote unless you can tell me how many bubbles are in a bar of soap or how many beans are in a can. Obviously, they have a racial impact, and was the real force behind them historically. And I think there are also lingering racial effects on many of these activities. And the nefarious kind, the kind of voter suppression that we think of as kind of evil, is where you're doing so to try to cut out a certain segment of society, whether it's racial minorities, whether it's one political party. And unfortunately, ours is a history of voter suppression. So what I try to do in my book is I try to contrast that with, we have this voter suppression. At the same time, there are mechanisms to push back against that. And, ours is a history, I think, of ever expanded voter access. If you think about our founding, the first elections were only white male property owners that can vote. And, now 100 years, we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment that gave women the right to vote. So obviously our elections are better now than they were then, but they're still not perfect. And modern day voter suppression tactics, I think, are one reason for that.
So, I mean, do you think that we're starting to head in a more positive direction, even with, everything you hear in the news and the media going on right now? Like today, do you feel like there is still an active element out there trying to cause and create voter suppression, or is it the opposite where things are starting to open up and get better, or is it a mix of both?
I think it's a dual story. I think there's only almost two tracks. And in fact, sadly, I think you almost see two Americas in terms of their voting policies, with one set of states that have certain policies that are much more inclusive and make it easier to participate, and another set of states that make it harder to vote and have a lot of voter restrictions. And it's not going to surprise you, unfortunately, that tracks partisan lines as well, where one party is seen right now is trying to make it easier to vote, and the other party is seen as trying to make it harder to vote because of the effects, I think, that those political parties feel like they'll have on their ability to win, on the outcomes. So it's really a dual track. It's a complicated story. You have these voter suppression tactics like voter purges of the registration rolls, like photo ID requirements. But at the same time, you have what I call pro-voter policies, like easing registration rules, allowing people to register on election day and vote. No requirement that you register ahead of time. Or before the pandemic, we had states moving towards universal vote by mail, where everyone was automatically sent a ballot. And I think that's actually happening in both so-called red and so-called blue states. But it's a great example of a pro-voter policy.
Yeah, and I guess it's really interesting because those two different sides that are both making progress further solidify the red and the blue states in a way. But it's like a lot of those red states might be more blue if there wasn't so much voter suppression in the cities and in the urban areas, because that's where the highest concentration of people are. So I suppose that's why it's important that to pay attention to each state whatever state you live in, what the policies are on that stuff and help. And that's why I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about some organizations that are out there that do help, let's say in low-income neighborhoods that are hurt the most by voter suppression, voter ID, for instance, helping people get state-issued IDs, and helping people get to the polls in one way or another, helping to open more polling locations. Are there some organizations that it's good to point to for that? Or, I mean, I'm sure there's many, so it's hard to pinpoint. But
yeah, and let me emphasize that I talk about the red and the blue differences in terms of how we vote. That's not universal, which is to say that there are some voter policies that are being passed in both red and blue places around the country. And so what I think, in this super polarized time period, we actually need to focus on the kinds of policies that are receiving widespread support, like universal vote by mail, like same-day voter registration, and like getting IDs into people's hands if we're going to have a photo ID requirement like you just mentioned. And so the groups that I point to are all nonpartisan. They're just all about getting people to vote. So one excellent organization is called Vote Riders. This is a group that goes into states and communities and as you mentioned, cities, and just helps people obtain the IDs that they need, which, that helps them not only for voting, but in their everyday lives. Because, although voter ID laws are a form of voter suppression because they tend to target the people who don't have an ID, and the people who don't tend to have an ID are poor, racial minorities, students, elderly, and so it has a disproportionate impact on certain communities. But what a group like Vote Riders does is goes into those communities and help people, for example, obtain their birth certificate that they might need to get an ID. Another similar group is called Spread the Vote. Spread the Vote focuses really on students and minority communities in particular. I profile both of those organizations in my book. As you said, there's tons of organizations. And in fact, the appendix to my book has a list of all 50 states and about 3 or 4 organizations in each one that are working on issues of democracy reform. So my hope is that someone reads the book, feels inspired that they too can make a difference, flips to the back to find their state, and contacts one of the organizations that's listed for their state.
Very cool.
So I have a couple of, like a 3-part question kind of. How long has voting by mail been around? How many votes each year typically, not in a pandemic obviously, come in by mail/absentee? And also, is it true that mail/absentee ballots are the same in all but 5 states?
Okay, so 3-part question there in terms of first, how long have we been voting by mail? All states have had some kind of vote by mail since the Civil War, and that's absentee balloting. Because it was really Abraham Lincoln who wanted to continue being able to fight in the war in 1864, and yet had all these troops scattered about, fighting against the Confederacy. And so states came up with absentee balloting procedures so these soldiers didn't have to come home to vote, in part so he can get reelected. So states have had absentee balloting for decades. Many states put it in their state constitution, that a requirement that absentee balloting is available. Now, in terms of the differences between absentee balloting and vote by mail and universal vote by mail, these are all terms that are thrown around a lot. So 5 states, as you mentioned, automatically mail a ballot to every registered voter in the state. Those are Washington, Oregon, Colorado, Utah, and California. Almost all of California used to, and now this year California will be an entirely vote by mail state. But you also have states like Arizona, which about 75% of the vote in Arizona is by mail. Minnesota, I think, is a pretty high. I think it's over 50%. These states that have, what's called no excuse absentee balloting, that is, you don't need to provide an excuse, you can just request your ballot. You're not automatically receiving it without doing anything, but the voters themselves like the process so much that so many voters go ahead and do it, again, even before the pandemic. So the question of, how is it different between the states? There's universal vote by mail, which I refer to as the states that automatically send you a ballot. And again, there's 5 of those, and I think there's 5 more that are going to do it for this year as kind of a one-time deal. But I suspect they're going to see the success of that, and they may continue it. And then there's the other states where anyone can get an absentee ballot, but you have to request it. And then there's the final set of states where you need an excuse still to vote absentee. Right now, as the time of that we're chatting, 6 states for the 2020 election are still requiring an excuse, and COVID-19 doesn't count. Concerns about COVID-19 don't count in 6 states.
What states those are?
So it's Texas is one of the big offenders, Tennessee, Indiana, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Mississippi are the evil 6. Perhaps we can call them, because they're the ones that I think are still making it too hard to vote. That said, even those states, there's litigation going on right now. There's lawsuits in those states, and there's legislation being proposed. South Carolina might come off the list because one house of their state legislature has passed a rule to let anyone vote by mail if they just cite a coronavirus concern. So we'll see. I mean, the time is running short. But right now, as of our taping of this, it's 6 states.
Yeah, I mean, I live in Texas, and I actually looked into this, and that is what I found out. I was like, oh no, like I absolutely have to go, and I made the commitment. Obviously, like I'm gonna get up, I'm gonna stand in line, no matter how long it takes, to make sure that my vote is counted.
So I have a question. It's that people are starting to get a little bit nervous about their mail-in ballots, and like we're seeing articles come out now that your votes won't be counted, for a few days after election night. So on election night this year, we're not going to know who the president of the United States technically is. And, it gives people a lot of anxiety on whether they should, take that risk or, just show up at the polls. And, back in the day, we had that situation where, a lot of votes were contested with George Bush, and there you had the hanging Chad. And now I hear that there's 5 different ways your mail-in ballot could be, thrown out if your signature doesn't match. What would you say to people who are a little bit anxious about that situation?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things to discuss there. So, one, we do know that the rate of ballot rejection is higher with absentee or mail-in ballots than it is with in-person votes. So, if you're able to vote in person, especially if there's an early voting period where you can show up in person early voting, if that's a concern of yours, it's not a bad thing to do that. There's been a lot of conversation about the U.S. Postal Service and the delivery of ballots. I think that, especially as we get closer and closer to November 3rd, it's maybe a better bet to deliver your ballot through a drop box. And virtually every state has secure drop boxes to take ballots. So if you don't feel like you want to trust the Postal Service, maybe it makes more sense to hand deliver your ballot through the drop box. But to your broader question about, election night, we're used to staying up late. And, eventually the networks make a call as to who the next president of the United States will be. I think it's very unlikely we're going to see that this year. And here's why. So many of our ballots across lots of states, including the so-called swing states, are going to be by mail. And those ballots can't be counted until November 3rd, until what we traditionally consider Election Day. Some of the states can start processing them, right, to make sure signatures match and whatnot, but actually the counting can't happen until November 3rd. So we may know a count based on who showed up in person and whose ballots have been delivered already in some of the states, but that will be very incomplete. The other thing we know about mail-in ballots is that for whatever reason, Democrats tend to vote by mail more and tend to deliver their ballots later in the election season. And so this is referred to, as well documented, as the big blue shift. That is, as the counts go on after Election Day, as more and more ballots come in after Election Day and they're counted, and these are perfectly valid, Democrats tend to do better. We saw this in 2018, actually, where the media didn't recognize kind of a big wave in the congressional elections on election night. But as the ballots were counted in places like Arizona and other places, California, that have a lot of mail-in ballots, Democrats started doing a lot better. And so I think we can expect the vote totals to shift from November 3rd in the next several days after that. And that's perfectly normal. That's just the ballots being counted. And, just the phenomenon of Democratic-leaning ballots tend to come in later. There's nothing fraudulent about that. And to dispel one other myth, lots of people I hear say, well, I've heard that absentee ballots don't count unless it makes a difference in the outcome. That is absolutely not true. Every single absentee ballot counts. The election is not final until it's certified by the election officials. What we hear on election night is just the media doing the media's thing and nothing else besides that.
We should be bracing for a almost month-long time after election night of not knowing who the president is.
Well, I don't think it'll be a month is my guess, because although that's the deadline, states will finish well before that, right? So, I think within maybe a week or so, we'll have a good sense of who the next president is. And, obviously we'll come down to some of the key states like Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania and Florida, some of those swing states, and how long did they take for their ballot counting?
Well, with the current president talking about, voter fraud and in mail-in, voting, I just had a few questions on that. And, how prevalent is voter fraud? And with the current president also telling people, whether in jest or in seriousness, to go put in a mail-in vote and then also vote in person, what's the likelihood of that being caught by election officials? Like how good is the structure to be able to count, to be able to see if that has happened and to discard those votes? And are those people who do that, A, breaking the law, B, are both their votes not counted, and C, what's the penalty for that?
Yeah, so let me take your first question on voter fraud first. How much voter fraud is there? The answer is very little. So we talk about voter fraud different kinds of ways, the kind of voter fraud that exists. So let's talk about photo ID requirements. Photo ID laws only root out one kind of fraud. That's in-person impersonation, someone showing up to the polls pretending to be someone they're not. That happens almost never. One study of over a dozen years looked at basically every election during those dozen years, so over 1 billion ballots cast, and found only 31 possible instances of voter fraud. And then when diving into those 31, about half of them were things like a father and a son with the same name, and the juniors showing up and getting checked in under the senior's name with the poll book. So, voter fraud, it just does not happen. So the specific question about double voting, right? Sending in your mail-in ballot and then showing up to the polls. First, election officials have a mechanism to track that, because when they send your absentee ballot out, it's tracked and there's a record in it with your name. So when you show up to the polls, they're going to say, hey, hold up, you've requested an absentee ballot. Yeah. Now, if you say, well, I never received it, you're going to have to cast what's called the provisional ballot, which is basically the same ballot, but it's set aside, and then we figure out after Election Day whether it should count or not. If you have submitted your absentee ballot, the election officials are going to say, your absentee ballot's been received, and if you try to vote here in person on the machine, you're committing a felony. That's double voting. Every state and federal law makes it a crime to vote twice. So the system is set up to catch this. Now, I think election officials are going to be completely overwhelmed if you have thousands upon thousands of people doing what the president suggested. So it's dangerous for the election system, and they're committing a felony if they do it. But there are mechanisms based on ballot tracking to root out this when it might occur on occasion.
Yeah, and I think perhaps part of the, we're trying not to be too partisan here, but I think a lot of the reason that he may have suggested that is because voter fraud is so rare. He wants to show up, well, this year with this mail-in, there was so much fraud. You had people doing this and that, and everyone will forget by that time that he's actually the one who suggested it. And so he could be trying to create some unrest or some confusion in that way. So I'm glad that we're that we're clarifying that.
And this is not a partisan statement for me to say that it's very dangerous for the president of the United States to be undermining the democratic norms that we have used for years, to be undermining the hard work of local election officials, and planting these ideas, which is going to overwhelm the system. If we have a free and fair democracy, we should let everyone vote and let the chips fall as they may. And unfortunately, throughout the year, he's been undermining the legitimacy of the election process, presumably in case he loses, then he can have something to latch onto to potentially contest the results. But it's really dangerous for democracy. And again, that's not a partisan statement. It's a factual statement. I would say that about any candidate who is making these kinds of wild accusations without any facts whatsoever.
Well, this has been a lot of really, really good information. Can't thank you enough for being here, Professor.
My pleasure. It's great to have you all doing this and, reaching out to your fans and making sure, because, our democracy is only as strong as everyone who participates in it. Our Declaration of Independence says that democracy is legitimate based on the consent of the governed. Shouldn't the governed include all of us? And that's really what I'm all about, is finding ways to make sure, I don't care who you vote for. I don't care which side wins. I, of course, have my personal preferences, but as a scholar of democracy, I care about democracy flourishing through everybody participating. And that's really what this is all about.
Absolutely. Awesome, man. Thank you so much.
And your book highlights that well. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now, finally, for our musical segment, Nikki and I are joined by Nigel Hall and Steve Watkins on this OJ's tune, Put Our Heads Together. Check it out.
All right, let's put our heads together. Maybe 1 bar count off, because that's all I got. All right. 1, 2, 3.
All right, everybody, that's it for this time. Thanks so much to our panel, to all of our wonderful guests, to our musical guests. Join us again next time for episode 2. Until then, stay safe, much love, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.